is Michaela Stubbs. I work for No More Empty Pots in Omaha. We are a food hub, commercial kitchen, community source agriculture hub in Omaha. And we do our best to help the community find local produced food. We have commercial kitchens for renters and food entrepreneurs. We also have a community a culinary certificate program, as well as a community education program that we offer to Omaha, Nebraska. So a little bit about us today. We are going to be doing a business development webinar talking about legal forms of business. We'll be joined by Erin Antz from Lamson, Dugan, and Murray here in Omaha as well. So we'll have a lot of information for you today. We'll go through some upcoming events and workshops that will be happening in the area, and then go into the information about legal forms of business for you. There will be time for questions at the end, so please have those saved and ready to go. Should be pretty quick day today. Some of the events that are coming up for in our area, we have the Small Business Resource Fair at the venue, 2112 North 30th Street. It's going to be a great event with 25 plus local resource partners. You'll be able to learn a lot. RFBC will also be there, as well as No More Empty Pots. That is brought on to you by Nebraska Enterprise Fund. So please come for that. It is a free event. You can register there in the link. And then we also have our No More Empty Pots block party happening this Saturday. That is from 3 to 6 following the Florence Day Parade. There will be food vendors, food trucks, artists, makers, community information booths. So tons of stuff to see there as well. Should be a great time. It's our first one, and we are super excited to present that to you in the community. We'll have 47 tables set up, as well as a silent auction on the rooftop, so you can support local businesses, help support No More Empty Pots and our mission and what we do for the community. So I hope to see you there. It should be a really great time. Again, another free event. Just come out and show your support, see your community members, learn a little bit about what's going on in the community. Ben, you want to take over the workshops for business builders? And
yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Michaela. So a couple of extension events coming up here. We are doing a series of business builder workshops. We just had one last week in Lincoln. We will also be at the resource fair on Thursday up in Omaha. Looking forward to that. But the next business builder workshop will be out in Scotts Bluff, May 21st. In the evening, 6 to 7:30 p.m. And basically, we're out there. We're going to bring resource providers. It'll be kind of like a resource fair type of a setup, but you'll get a chance to sit down with the different entities that are there, different organizations that are there, talk to them about your business, your farm, and learn what kind of resources they have. That QR code there on the left for that one to register. These are our free events as well. And then we are doing a weekly open office hours virtually on Zoom every Wednesday, 4:30 to 5:30. So if you have questions about marketing, business development, business planning, finding grants for your food or farm business, you can come in and ask us any of those kind of questions, and we'd be happy to chat with you. So just a couple things coming up there from us. Thanks.
Awesome. So yeah, this webinar will be really about choosing the right legal structure for the business that you want to have. So we'll talk about the management and control aspects, tax obligations that you might have depending on the form you choose to go with, and then of course the legal and financial considerations to take with those. Take a time to think about like what are the different legal structures. We'll go through those and then help you decide which one is right for your business. So with that, I will introduce Erin Antz. She is our professional in all of this, so I'm very happy that she's chosen and decided to help us out with this. So yeah, Erin, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Michaela. So like Michaela said, I'm Erin Antz, and I'm an attorney based in Omaha, Nebraska at Lamson, Dugan, and Murray. We have an Omaha office. We also have a West Des Moines office. And a lot of my practice is helping closely held businesses. I don't say small businesses because a lot of times these businesses grow to be, something really big, but closely held is kind of the key there being, we have a small team of ownership. We have a small, kind of closely held business that is managed and controlled by a, one individual or a small group of individuals. And so a lot of what we're talking about today is going to be, kind of for any type of business that you're starting, not just a food or agriculture-based business, but we can kind of talk specific to some of the things that you might think about specifically for those types of businesses as well. So kind of general information, we can talk a little bit how it might apply to your businesses specifically, and then at the end, obviously open for questions as well. So we can kind of go ahead and get started there. Michaela's slide has 6 forms of doing business. These are kind of 6 entity structure options, and we'll kind of go through them and talk about kind of pros, cons, when they might be helpful, and kind of try to help you get an understanding of what the options are so you can make an informed decision that makes sense for your specific business idea and specific set of facts. Go ahead and hit the next slide. Thanks. So starting out, we can start with number 1. And I guess before we even get into there, let's talk about kind of just generally, if you're going to have a for-profit entity, you're going to operate a business and you're going to make money. We have a couple different types. We call them filing and no filing. And that just means, are you going to have to file something with the Secretary of State in the appropriate state, in this case, Nebraska, in order to officially form your business and have it on file with them? A sole proprietorship is not a filing entity. You don't need to do anything with the Secretary of State in order to operate as a sole proprietorship. So when we talk about the no filing entities, this is going to be one of the most common. A sole proprietorship and a partnership are going to be those no filing. What does that mean? All it means is that this is a business owned and operated by one person for personal profit. You're automatically considered to be a sole proprietorship if you do business activities, but you don't register as any other type of business. So, this is not a separate business entity. It's easy because it's just you, going out and doing business as yourself. I'm Erin, and, Erin is out there selling, baked goods. It's not Erin LLC. It's not some separate entity. It's just me, myself, Erin Arts, going out there and transacting business that way. What it does mean, however, if I'm just going out there and doing it myself, is that my business assets and liabilities aren't separate from my personal assets and liabilities. You can personally be held liable for the debts and obligations of the business. And essentially, we like some separation there for most circumstances, simply because it protects the personal from the business. And so sole proprietorship doesn't really have that. It's easy and it's simple because it's just you going out there and, doing business without any sort of, formal structure or governing documents or registration. But if you are doing business, we typically are going to recommend a different structure of business, simply because it protects your personal from your business, and vice versa. So that's kind of, a general, you may already be doing business as a sole proprietorship, but as you grow, as you expand, as you, have these conversations and come to these webinars, you're likely going to be moving in a different direction with respect to the legal structure of your business, simply for the protection purposes that we'll talk about that some of these other entities offer. Go ahead and next slide. So a limited liability company, on the other hand, is kind of the quintessential, this separates the personal from the business. And so a limited liability company is a structure that allows you to, by filing, so this is a filing entity, filing a articles of an organization or a certificate of organization with the state's Secretary of State office. This gives your business a name that has LLC on the end. So you've likely seen a lot of these types of businesses, Erin's Coffee and Cookies LLC. I'm no longer doing business as Erin myself. I'm doing business as this entity that it has that indication of LLC at the end of its name. how does it work? In addition to forming it and kind of jumping through some setup hoops, publishing notice, getting a tax ID number, things that come along with kind of forming an entity. We also want to kind of talk about how the business is operated. It's no longer me just as myself making decisions for myself and doing business as myself. There's going to be a little bit more formality there. And that just means there's going to be an operating agreement. And this is going to define kind of who are the members or the owners of this company. How are profits and losses allocated between those members, and who makes decisions on behalf of the company, and what kind of consensus do we need to have if there's more than one owner of this LLC? Do we all have to be on board before decisions can be made? Do we get to rule by majority vote? Things like that. And then when it comes to control, we have owners who are members. You're a member of an LLC. It's kind of, you would use that term kind of synonymous with shareholder for a corporation, someone who has an equity interest in the company. And, they can be member managed LLCs or manager managed LLCs. Oftentimes we have manager managed LLCs, even if every single owner is also a manager. And that just is so we have someone sign something as manager, and you're conveying to the world that you have the authority to act on behalf of the company. So it's just kind of the term manager is assigned to the rest of the world that you're authorized to take this action. And it just kind of cuts through the red tape of, letting a manager make day-to-day decisions on behalf of the company without requiring kind of formal company action on each and every single bit of business that the company does. The big things are still going to require that formality, but giving, one or more people the title of manager allows them to kind of unilaterally make decisions about day-to-day things, signing for a delivery when it comes, things like that it simply wouldn't be feasible to kind of convene everyone who has an ownership interest to take some of those smaller everyday actions. Liability wise, unlike the sole proprietorship, your personal assets are protected from your business. And that is as long as you kind of maintain certain formalities. In the legal world, they call it piercing the corporate veil when you don't maintain those formalities. And they can say, yeah, you have this separation between your personal and your business, but it's all really convoluted because you haven't really kept those things really separate. So, you don't get that protection that the LLC is intended to offer. And that really is just a way of saying, we want to make sure what is company activity is recorded separately. It has its, the company has its own bank account. The company is, approving actions on behalf of the company. And there's kind of formal documentation whenever anything goes from the personal to the business or vice versa, simply so that you can prove, to whoever may come knocking and asking questions about it, hey, I've maintained these separate entities. This isn't an extension of me. It's really its own separate entity that, there's clear documentation showing that separation. And so that's kind of the main attraction of the LLC is that limited liability, as well as, unlike a corporation, which we'll talk about in a little bit, LLCs have a lot of flexibility as far as how profits and losses can be allocated between partners or members, how, the company is managed, just a lot of flexibility to kind of make this entity work for whatever situation that you are in or that you're contemplating. So we'll talk a lot about LLCs simply because most people end up with an LLC for a newly formed business. And that's because of those kind of, low level of administrative requirements or complexity, flexible management, ownership, governance, and just the ability to have this be the structure that you form with the state, but it also offers different tax options. And so it kind of is a good starting point and a jumping off point for a lot of businesses that are just starting out. So really in some, main advantage is that each member has limited liability and personal is protected from business as long as you maintain the formalities, the separate books, the separate records, all of those things that you're going to want to keep in order to make sure that protection stays in place. For tax purposes, this slide talks about the 3 different kind of tax options. And what options are available to you if you form an LLC are going to depend on how many owners the LLC has. So owners or members, we kind of use those terms interchangeably. If you are the only member of your LLC, you will be taxed as a disregarded entity by default. What does that mean? It means that for liability purposes, you're separate, you're protected. But for tax purposes, the LLC is treated as if it doesn't exist. And all that means is that if I had my single member LLC, and I did nothing but form it and I was the sole member, it would be a disregarded entity. And at the end of the year, whatever financial activity was on my LLC's books, I would report on my personal 1040 tax return, my personal income tax return, and I would pay taxes at my own personal rate on whatever income was generated from the business's activities. So it's kind of the best of both worlds in a lot of cases when you're just starting out, because just like a sole proprietorship, you put that, on your personal 1040 and you don't have a separate tax reporting obligation. But unlike the sole proprietorship, we still have that legal distinction and that liability protection of having that kind of LLC be the legal entity under which the operations are happening. And so, disregarded entity would be the default if there's one member. If there are more than one member, the default is you are taxed as a partnership. And all that means is that profits and losses of the company are allocated between the partners or the members on an informational tax return, but the LLC itself doesn't pay any taxes. It says, hey, my company has reported $100,000 of income for this year. We have 2 50/50 owners. So I'm going to give a return, a K1 to each of the members, and each of them get to report $50,000 of the $100,000 of income on their personal tax return. So it's just an extra step to get to the same place, which is that you're reporting income and paying income on your personal tax return. But because there's more than one member, it doesn't all go to one place. And so they have that extra interim step to say, this is how we're dividing it between the members. And then you go put it on your personal 1040, unlike a disregarded entity, a single member LLC, where it's 100% owned by one person. So we don't need to take that interim step. We just take that bottom line and we put it all on that one owner's 1040. So those are kind of the default options. And then there's a slide later on where we'll talk about S corporations. And S corporation is not a type of entity that you form with the Secretary of State, but it's a tax status that you can elect with the IRS. And it just provides some benefits in certain situations that you may want to opt into. But if you don't opt into them by electing the status, your LLC would either be taxed as a disregarded entity if you're single member, or a partnership if you are multi-member. So we'll talk about the S election a little bit later on. But when we're talking about limited liability companies, corporations, all of those things, those are the entities that we're forming at the state level. But the S Corp is a tax option that's available to both types of entities when we're talking about kind of the IRS and dealing with them. How does the IRS look at us and how do they classify us? So it's a little confusing just because we're talking kind of state level formation, tax treatment, and you can be more than one thing. And so that's kind of where the S status comes in, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to that slide. But just know that if we choose that we don't want that default option of disregarded entity or partnership, we do have the ability to opt into this other status, and it makes sense in certain situations to do that. So we'll talk about those a little bit later on. But that's certainly something that we want to clarify and to talk about, just because those are important distinctions that sometimes people, lose sight of, just because we talk about, oh, I have an S corp, and really we have an LLC that has a certain tax status, and we want to just be clear when we're talking about it from a legal and tax perspective, that we're being clear about kind of what type of entity we have and how it's taxed. Go ahead and next slide. So a nonprofit organization, this is, basically a different type of entity. You wouldn't necessarily most times, be choosing, you may say, hey, I don't know if I should have an LLC or a corporation. Either way, you're operating for profit and you're operating to make money. A nonprofit organization, on the other hand, is kind of a different story, where it's, hey, we have a charitable purpose and we're going to get this basically, form an entity for this specific charitable purpose. Hopefully we'll get income tax benefits from the IRS because of our charitable purpose. And we're doing this not for our own personal gain to build, equity in a business that will, basically be attributed to us. We're really doing this to serve that charitable purpose. And you'll see kind of what I mean when we talk about the certain restrictions or requirements that you have to have before you get those tax benefits. So a nonprofit is a business that serves a public purpose. But beyond that, I think it's important to talk about the difference between nonprofit and tax exempt. You are not tax exempt automatically because you form a nonprofit corporation, but you form a nonprofit corporation to then apply for this tax exempt status in a lot of cases. So to start a nonprofit, you would form a nonprofit corporation with the Nebraska Secretary of State by filing those articles of incorporation. And in those articles of incorporation, you would provide some specific information about what is my charitable purpose? What is this organization designed to do for the good of the public, essentially? And then on top of that, it requires certain things to be included in those articles, including, for example, if I decided I was no longer going to run this organization, what happens to the assets that it owns? So, in one of the, classes that I teach or the things that I do, I often use the hypothetical of, I own a cat cafe. I'm a cat rescue that tries to get cats adopted, and I also serve coffee. It's very, very cool, very trendy. You can go to the cat cafes anywhere these days. So I could operate it for my own personal gain, but I could also say, I want those tax benefits. I'm operating this for a charitable purpose. Maybe I want to be a nonprofit and be a 501c3. So if I did that, and a couple of years in, I just said, hey, I don't want to do this anymore. I can't just turn around and take what's in the, bank account of the nonprofit. I can't, take whatever assets we've acquired to basically run this rescue in this coffee shop and say, those are just going to go in my personal bank account now, and I'm just going to take those home. One of the hallmarks of a nonprofit is that you have to, if you're winding up your operations, you have to then take whatever's left in your organization at the end of that winding up process, and you have to give it to another organization that is basically operated for similar purposes. And so one thing that's important to know about a nonprofit organization is that it can do a lot of good. You can still be paid a reasonable salary for the work that you do for your nonprofit, but it's not a way to build wealth in the same way that a for-profit entity would be. You know, you get your salary, you know, a fair salary for the work that you're performing. And you get to do a lot of good and help, you know, people and kind of work towards this charitable purpose that you are, you know, passionate about. But at the end of the day, what's built up in the company is not yours to keep. And so that's one thing that's really important for entrepreneurs or people who are starting a business, especially, to know, is that you don't really have that ability to build equity and build wealth in the same way. On the flip side, without being a nonprofit and obtaining tax exempt status from the IRS, you may not be eligible for grants. You may not be eligible for you know, certain funds and things like that that are earmarked for charities and for 501c3 tax exempt organizations. And so when you're talking about a nonprofit, you know, one of the things to weigh as an entrepreneur is, you know, is it really important to me to have this status so I can get these funds, you know, that are earmarked for nonprofits and 501c3s, and you know, do I need that funding in order to carry out my purpose and start my business? Or is this something that is better done for profit because I want to build equity and build wealth beyond just being a salaried employee of this organization? And so that's an important thing to think about. When you form a nonprofit, just remember nonprofit does not automatically equal tax exempt. A nonprofit is kind of the state filing, like I said, that has to meet those requirements. But then you have to apply to the IRS for tax exempt status by filing a Form 1023 or a 1023-EZ, depending on the size of your organization. And you have to basically give them certain information, tell them about your operations, and apply so that they will, you know, grant you that tax exempt status. So when you hear 501c3, that's the Internal Revenue Code section that basically, you know, is equivalent or, you know, refers to the fact that you don't have to pay federal income tax as an organization. And so, you know, tax exempt is the goal. That's why a lot of people start nonprofit corporations, but just by starting a nonprofit doesn't mean you automatically don't pay taxes. That's kind of a hoop you have to jump through with the IRS after you form and establish your company. So those are, you know, kind of the basics as far as when you're thinking about which, you know, is a nonprofit organization, is a tax exempt organization the way that I want to go. Consider the source of funds that you know, have available to you. Are there grants that you're looking to get, and do those only get awarded to certain type of entities versus, you know, the fact that a for-profit entity, you know, you don't necessarily have the same oversight, you don't have the same restrictions, and you get the ability to kind of build equity and build wealth in a way that's just not possible with a nonprofit organization or tax exempt organization, just based on what their purposes are and what they're meant to do. Next slide. So like we talked about, an S Corp is not a business entity, it's a tax designation. And so an LLC or a corporation, which I believe we'll talk about in a slide or two, are both types of entities that could elect S status. They could make an S election. And what does that mean, and why would you do that? So to qualify for an S corporation status, you have to meet these requirements up on the left. You know, you have to be a domestic corporation or LLC, so you have to be formed in the United States. You have to have 100 or fewer shareholders or members. You can only have one class of ownership interest. And there are certain restrictions as well, as far as what type of entity you can be. I don't see a lot of those affecting a food or agriculture type of business. You know, okay, great. Maybe you meet all these characteristics, but why would you elect it? And then if you decide to elect it, how do you elect it? Sometimes people will make this election to essentially, you know, get employment tax savings. is the main reason that a small business kind of, would do this or why it would make sense. Unlike a LLC that by default might be taxed as a partnership or taxed as a disregarded entity, there, all of your income that you're getting from that business is subject to self-employment taxes. So, that's everything that's coming onto your 1040 is going to be subject to those taxes. You can't be an employee of your own single member LLC. You can't be an employee of a partnership that you're part of, or an LLC that's taxed as a partnership that you're a part of. And so everything that goes on to your personal tax return in those situations gets basically you pay self-employment tax on every dollar that you're reporting. With S status, if you make that election, you can be an employee of this entity that you also own. And so why does that matter? It means that you can kind of split your income into two different buckets, and you can save on employment taxes on one of those two buckets. And so you, as the owner of a business that's elected S status, can be an employee of the business. You get a reasonable salary, and there are complicated IRS rules about what's reasonable, but basically, if you were performing this role for someone else, what would you get paid to do it for? You can pay yourself that as a salary, and that's a W-2 that you get that's subject to employment taxes. But above and beyond that reasonable salary, if your business is making additional profit, you can distribute that profit to yourself. And that's not subject to those same employment taxes, FICA taxes, things like that. And so there's a possibility for employment tax savings if you are going to own this entity, you're going to perform services for it and receive a paycheck. And if there's money above and beyond that reasonable salary, you can basically save money on those profit distributions above and beyond your normal pay. And so it can result in overall lower tax liability, and is something that is worth considering. One thing that was on one of the slides earlier talked about unless you elect S status, don't give yourself a W-2. That's important. The only way that you can be an employee of your business and get a W-2 is, in a lot of cases, if you are an S corporation. If you're a for-profit entity, you can't, like I said, can't be an employee of your own LLC. If you're the only owner, you can't be the employee of a partnership that you're a partner or a member in. And so in a lot of situations, this is the way that you would be able to be an employee and get those kind of benefits. And if you don't have this in place, you're not going to typically be able to issue yourself a W-2. And so that's something to be aware of, and just kind of have in the back of your head as you're setting up your structure, as you're setting up your payroll, as you're doing any of those things. You want to make sure that you have the right legal form and the right tax status to do things in the way that you're contemplating doing them. One thing that I would say is that it's a lot easier to elect S status later on than it is to get rid of it down the road. And so when in doubt, if you're just starting out and you don't know kind of whether this is really going to provide you a, significant tax savings and is worth the hoops that you have to jump through, you can always elect it at a later date on a going forward basis. And so that's something that you should just be aware of. And to the extent that you work with lawyers, accountants, tax advisors, things like that, those are conversations that you can be having as far as, does it make sense for me to make this election now? If not, at what point might it make sense? And just revisit that down the road as you continue to grow. Because at some point, even if it doesn't make sense for you now, it very well could down the road. But businesses where you are performing services on a regular basis for the entity are usually good candidates for at least a conversation about S status, because you can potentially get that employment tax savings That's important when you're kind of boots on the ground working, significant hours for your business. It doesn't make sense in, for example, like a real estate holding company or something like that, but in a situation where you are performing work, in a restaurant, a agriculture, any of those types of contexts, this is certainly worth a conversation. And even if doesn't make sense now, it's always something that down the road could make sense. And so it's important to understand it and kind of have those conversations with your advisors about when and, how and why this might make sense for your business. That's the other thing, I guess, before we go to hybrid, the other thing on S Corps would be the one thing that trips people up a lot of times is only one class of stock or ownership interest can be issued in an S corporation. And so a lot of times, if you're looking to get investors, they might want some preferential treatment to get their capital returned to them. They may want certain rights as shareholders that not all other shareholders get. And that's where it gets tricky if you are an S Corp, because you have to adhere to this rule that there's only one class of ownership interests allowed. And so you hear a lot of times about like preferred stock and, common stock. And typically those aren't going to be allowed in an S corporation situation. The one thing that you can do, and the IRS has said that this doesn't, create two classes of stock, is you can have voting and non-voting interests. And so you may be able to say, hey, someone wants to come in and invest in my business. I still want to have control over the business because I'm the founder, I'm the creative, person. I'm the one who actually understands this business and is going to be, operating on a daily basis, but I need his capital. You could potentially have voting and non-voting interests so that they don't get a say in certain types of business decisions, but they still have equal rights to profits and things, distributions, things of that nature. So if you're looking to gather investors, S status might not be right for you if the investors have specific requirements about what rights they need to have in order to invest. But there are ways to get investors while also keeping control, and management authority within your company as well. So that's kind of a complicated area of the IRS has a lot of rules about what is allowed and isn't allowed. But the one thing that I would say is that generally all interests in an S corporation have to have equal distribution rights. They have to have equal, allocations of profits that are made on a pro rata basis. But there are some instances where you can have distinctions between different types of units or stock in your S corporation, and that's primarily going to be voting and non-voting. So if you're ever in that arena of, hey, I have some investors, they're making certain demands. If you have an S corp or are looking into S corp status, that's worth a conversation and worth some additional research just to make sure that you're not going to end up in a situation that inadvertently terminates the S election that you've made. So that is S corporation in a nutshell. And just to be clear, this is not, you don't go to the Nebraska Secretary of State and form an S corporation. You go to the Secretary of State and you form a corporation or a limited liability company. But then once you've done that, you then turn around, you go to the IRS and you say, I would like to elect to be taxed as an S corporation. For the IRS, LLCs don't exist. That's a state law creation. So they're really interested in which tax status do you have, where the Secretary of State's office is more interested in what state law type of entity do you have. And so those things aren't always going to be the same. And so once again, kind of important to have that distinction between the two when you are talking about the legal form of your entity versus the tax status of your entity. Just because those are going to be two related, but distinct and separate things. All right, a hybrid. So these are going to be certain types of entities that kind of combine some of the characteristics of both the for-profit and the nonprofit that we've talked about. And so there are a couple different types of these, which are listed up on the right-hand side, benefit corporations, low profit LLCs, some of those other things. And really the kind of distinction here is that we are here to make money, but we're also here to make a positive social impact. And so, what does that even mean, really? It just means that in addition to kind of making decisions based solely on profitability or what's kind of going to make the most make the most money for the corporation and therefore its shareholders, we have kind of loosened the reins a little bit. We've defined the fact that it's important to us as a company to, consider society, the environment, all of these other things, in addition to profit when making corporate decisions. And so we're kind of, also thinking about not just kind of financially what we're doing, but also kind of our purpose. Is there accountability? Is there transparency? And those are kind of, unique and slightly different than what you would see just the average for-profit corporation taking into account when making decisions. At that point, in a regular company, they're going to be making decisions based on what's in the best interest of the shareholders, and, what's going to make them money. And here we've kind of said that's important. We want to make money, but we also need to measure kind of our social impact and all of these other things. And so we've basically allowed our leaders, our board of directors, our governing body to take those things into account when making decisions, as well as kind of the financial bottom line. And so, an L3C, a low profit LLC, is really just the kind of hybrid version of an LLC. Only certain states allow these L3C entity types. And so if you're not in one of the handful of states that allows that, but you like this idea, you can always form one of these types of entities in a state that does allow it, and then register to do business as a foreign entity in, for example, Nebraska, if that's where you really want to operate and do business. The other option is just that benefit corporation instead, which is allowed in Nebraska and a lot of other states. That's kind of the more widely accepted version of these hybrids, as far as, states have gone to enact or to allow them. And in this case, it's really just the kind of corporate version of the same thing that the L3C is for LLCs. And so you still kind of have the same structure of the board of directors, all of those types of things. You just have these additional, kind of governing document provisions that allow the company to operate with these kind of non-financial aspects in mind, as well as the financial. So, for tax purposes, these entities don't differ from the basically traditional for-profit entity versions of those. Benefit corporation is going to be taxed as a corporation. And an LLC is going to have whatever tax status is assigned to it by default or by a selection. And really it's, sorry, excuse me. What I would say, the only last thing I'd say about these is, if it's something you're interested in, it takes a lot of just consideration to kind of define what those purposes are, what your social impact is, how you determine whether you meet those goals in a way that's not just a financial metric. Just invites a lot of conversations about the purpose and the, social issues that you're really forming this to help with or to combat. You also see a lot of times the B Corp designation that different entities will have. A benefit corporation is kind of different than the B Corp certification. And that's something that I don't think a lot of people realize. And the B Corp is a certification that's awarded by B Lab, which is a nonprofit organization out of Pennsylvania, I believe. And that basically just awards this to this certification to for-profit companies that, you know, meet high standards of, you know, social and environmental kind of awareness and performance. And so that's a certification that you can apply for. You don't need to be a benefit corporation in order to get this B Corp certification. And so, you know, just be careful when you're talking benefit corporation. That's something different. That's the legal structure. That's the legal entity versus a B Corp certification is just something that you can apply for and get from kind of a private, you know, well, it's a nonprofit, but kind of a, you know, a non-governmental entity that is going to award you this based on, you know, your application to them and kind of whether you meet the certain criteria that they've set forth for this certification. So benefit corporation, different than a B Corp certification. And, you know, for purposes of this hybrid entity side, we're talking benefit corporation, which is what you would go form with a state Secretary of State's office when actually going ahead and forming the entity.